Hey, what's up everyone? Here we go again. Today I'm going to be talking about Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. And much like my Bloodborne video, and any other From Software game I cover, this is really going to be an unscripted video. I'll have some bullet points laid out, so I've got some kind of structure, but I really want to talk about these games off the cuff, because like with Bloodborne, I won't be able to do it justice if I try and write a full script for it. We'll start off with a brief summary of the story, and then we'll get into, all the gameplay stuff. Releasing back in 2019, Sekiro really stood out compared to a lot of the other games that From Software released at the time, mainly being the Dark Souls series and Bloodborne obviously being action RPGs. Sekiro opted to be more of a action-adventure, stealth, character-driven game, which was quite the departure from what people were used to from the developer. And it also clearly took a lot of inspiration from an older series on the PS2 and PS1 called Tenchu, which was also a character-driven action-adventure stealth game. And I think Sekiro might have started off as a Tenchu sequel, especially the pairing with Activision, because Activision also published the Tenchu games in the West. Okay, let's quickly just summarize the story quickly. Not all of it, just in case people want to play it. But let's summarize the story and then we can move on to gameplay and stuff. So the game starts during the Sengoku period with the Ashina clan locked in a bloody civil war. Then they're led by Ishin Ashina. During this war, or after the war, I should say, an orphan boy is found wandering the battlefield by a shinobi called Owl. The boy gets named Wolf, like a lone wolf, and is trained by Owl in the way of the shinobi. As Wolf grows, he is entrusted by Owl, who becomes his adoptive father, to safeguard the young Lord Kuro, who is the last in a bloodline known as the Dragon's Heritage. Now, the game takes place 2 decades after this, so this is where the gameplay really starts. And Ashina has fallen kind of into ruin, like with most From Software games, right? The country is kind of, not the country, but the area that they claimed during the Civil War 20 years ago is now falling into ruin, and there are people invading and sneaking in, trying to unify all of Japan, right? And so during this time, Wolf is imprisoned, and the young lord is taken so they can abuse his dragon heritage bloodline in order to create an army of immortal soldiers so they can fight back and keep their what's the word? So they can keep their independency, so to say. So as Wolf, we fight back against this in order to rescue the young lord. Now that is really brief. Like there's much more to the story in that than that. But, I don't want to spoil it, just in case people do want to play it, because this game specifically it's much more dialogue, and there's much more like character depth than like the typical From Software games. There's a lot more like open dialogue between characters. The story is much more straightforward than like almost any other Souls game or like From Software game at the time. So I really encourage you to like go play the game and pay attention to the story, because it's really, really good. And that's why I'm not going to go into the story too much. I probably butchered that synopsis, but you know what I mean. Like, we're not here really for the story stuff. We want to get into the gameplay and all that, which is what we're going to do now. Oh, I forgot to mention, the game also does take a semi-realistic, like air quotations, approach to its storytelling. But it does also mix in a lot of like mythology and folklore with some of the enemy designs, some of the ideologies in the game. A lot of Buddhism is present within the story, or like Buddhism mythology and beliefs are within the story. So that's also there, which makes for a really interesting mix of realism and fantasy, which I think is really well done. Like, it's really well done. Okay, yeah, and now we'll go on to the gameplay. I forgot about that. Okay, let's actually move on to the gameplay now. We'll start off with general gameplay, like, movement, weapons, and all that good stuff. Then we'll move on to the bosses after. We'll give the bosses their own section, right? So Sekiro has a lot of freeform movement compared to the other From Software titles at the time. You know, like the ability to jump, no stamina bar, the grappling hook. All these things allow you to have much more freedom over your movement and a much more faster, visceral pace to the gameplay in general. Like, not just combat. Like, Wolf generally moves very, very quickly throughout the world. You know, you can hug walls, hang from ledges, you can crouch, sprint, jump. Much more freedom of movement compared to other FromSoft games at the time. Also, Sekiro only has one weapon. But with there being one weapon, it means the combat is much more focused, and they can hone in on a much more refined and focused combat system. So R1 is just your basic attack. Hold R1 to do a lunge attack. But there are also shinobi tools or shinobi prosthetics, which kind of come in the form of, they're like sub weapons, right? Which you can upgrade. There's throwing stars, like a flame vent cannon, firecrackers, a shield, like all these things. Like, and these are not really situational, but some work in better. Bleh, others work in different situations better than others, right? For example, some enemies will be vulnerable to the firecrackers, where smaller enemies and animals are weaker to the throwing stars, right? So this allows you to somewhat build Wolf in a way you want, but not with like the freedom of a full action RPG, right? Another key part of Sekiro's combat is the deflection and posture mechanics. So instead of you can hold L1 to block, but this is not recommended at all. You should really be focusing on parrying and perfect parrying, because you can like kind of get off parries where you're not kind of hitting the timing perfectly. But if you hit the timing perfectly, you will build the enemy's posture meter. Once the enemy's posture meter is full, you can inflict a killing blow, critical strike, whatever you want to call it. You also have a posture meter, so the same can be done for you. If you block too much and don't perfect parry, your posture will build up and your posture will break. But if you're perfect parrying, even if your bar is full and you're perfect parrying, your posture will never break. But if you do not perfect parry, your posture will break and the enemy will generally get a free hit in on you. Which leads to this really cool back and forth situation between you and enemies. Some attacks are obviously non-parryable. There's a red symbol will appear, which indicates this attack cannot be perfect parried. This attack cannot be parried. So in these situations, you either want to, there's sweeping attacks, which you want to jump over, and then you can jump again, and you'll kick off the enemy, which will build posture. Or if it's a lunging attack, or thrusting attack, once you unlock a certain ability within the skill tree, you can do something called a Mirakiri, I think that's how you pronounce it, counter, where you dash into the thrusting attack, and you'll get a huge posture build up, and usually a free hit with your sword after, depending on the enemy type, because some enemies can like thrust you off or throw you off them when you've done a Mirakiri counter. Sekiro also shares a lot in common with Tenchu, as in with the sub-tools and the single sword. Tenchu also had a single weapon, but then sub-weapons. So it shows more of that inspiration and influence that Sekiro took from Tenchu, which is a good thing, right? Because Tenchu was a very, very good action-adventure game for the time, and it's one of my favorites easily, which I might cover in a video in the future. Let's also touch on the stealth mechanic quickly. So being a ninja game, shinobi game, Sekiro also has a stealth system. Almost every common enemy, or pretty much every common enemy, can be killed instantly with stealth. If you can sneak up on them, you can hit them with stealth and they will die instantly. Certain areas in the game can be cleared completely through stealth, even though it's not possible to 100% stealth the game. It's not possible to go through the game completely in stealth. But even bosses, or certain bosses, I wouldn't say bosses, more like mini bosses or elite enemies, if you can sneak up on these, you can stealth attack them to remove a health bar, because normally mini bosses will have multiple health bars, or they'll require multiple killing blows to take down. So if you can sneak up on these enemies, you are able to remove one of those health bars to make the fight not as prolonged as it normally would be. Another interesting thing is that even though parrying is the key mechanic here, a lot of enemies will require different approaches to kill them efficiently. So like not all enemies, you can't focus on parrying for every single enemy. For example, bigger type enemies, sometimes it's bigger to directly go after their health bar. Instead of trying to parry them constantly and build up posture, some enemies, for example, like the ogre, you'll want to just focus on relentlessly attacking and dodging their attacks rather than trying to parry them, right? Because trying to parry them constantly is not an efficient way of dealing with them. Also, they are like shielded enemies, which, using the prosthetic tool axe, you can lead instantly into a death blow. So as long as you hit them with the axe, you get an instant kill, which shows that there's a lot of strategy that goes into the way that you generally want to fight different enemy types, along with like consumable items for divine type enemies, like using their divine blessing weapon buff, I think it's called, for like spiritual or spectral ghostly enemies. Those really are handy with those types of enemies. So there's a lot of variety in the way you can approach fighting the different enemy types. Okay, let's talk about some of the enemy types in the game quickly, because there are quite a few. Even though a lot of them boil down to like, different variants of human enemies, they are very distinct. They have different movesets and they behave differently. So we have like, bandit enemies, but different types, like shield enemies and bows and whatnot. There's also enemy ninja. A lot of them tend to have one arm, I believe. It seems like a lot of them are one-armed, which is pretty interesting. There's obviously samurai, dual-wielding samurais, great katana samurais, monks. Then there's animal-type enemies like wolves, giant chickens, There's crickets in some parts of the games, weird little bug enemies, which you don't see too often. Some of the more fantastical type enemies too, like ghosts and spirits. Also, the giant snake, but I wouldn't say that's like an enemy type, really. It's more of a unique enemy encounter. But there's quite a deep variety of enemies, especially like when you get into the boss fights. The boss fights are really where like a lot of the best encounters is really with the bosses. But that's not saying that like even normal enemies can be a problem, especially in groups. Like group enemy fights in this game are so difficult. I mean, you can cheese enemies with like, the mortal draw. You can just mortal draw groups of common enemies and they will all just die. But there's with the variety of enemies in the game, I feel like because each enemy type is kind of dedicated to its own area, not all the time, but sometimes, like general rule of thumb is that each area you're in tends to have its own enemy type. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, each area has its own dedicated enemy type, which really makes it feel like there's a really big variety of enemies, especially because, you go to this area and there's new enemies there. You go to this area and there's new enemies there. You feel like a sense of, this place is like distinct and different from the area I was before. And the variety of enemies really plays into that, even though, like I said, a lot of them does boil down to, different type of human enemy. It still makes it feel different because a lot of they will fight you differently. They require a different approach than just, a common grunt bandit, So I think there's a really good enemy variety in this game, and I think it really helps with boosting that sense of, I'm not just fighting the same enemy all the time. Like, you see enough enemy types in the different areas that you feel like it's unique. Alright, let's talk about the bosses. Not any boss specifically, but let's talk about the bosses. So, the bosses are really where the game basically just tells you to get good. Like, the bosses are probably the best experience in Sekiro. They are so good. They're like the peak of the game. Like, starting with the Lady Butterfly, right? Lady Butterfly, I think, is the boss, because a lot of people go to, uh, Gyobu first. A lot of players will end up encountering Gyobu first, but I think Lady Butterfly is the boss where, well, the tutorial message at the start of the fight kind of gives it away. But Lady Butterfly is really the boss that teaches you the back and forth between you and bosses, and how boss encounters will generally flow. And I think it's a perfect example of that, because even though Lady Butterfly isn't the hardest fight in the game, I think it's one of the best fights in the game at showing how boss encounters will generally work. And as you progress further into the game, some of the bosses will gradually get more fantastical and more, more climactic and epic and cinematic in perspective. Like, I think some of my favorite Genichiro is one of my favorite bosses atop Ashina Castle. I think that's a great fight. It's really, I think that fight specifically really shows off the depth of the combat and the back and forth of the combat, and I really, really like it, especially the parrying. Once you get into a flow in Sekiro, especially the bosses, because the bosses, they have a bigger health pool, multiple health bars. When you get into a flow of that, if it is so satisfying, and if you get like a clean sweep through a boss, it's so good. It feels really, really good. Like, further into the game, some of the bosses get extremely challenging. Like, the Corrupted Monk is one that can really stump players. I think Headless Ape is another one, or the ape boss in the Sunken Valley is a boss that really, I think a lot of people struggled with that one. For good reason. Like, he's kind of crazy, and the phase transition between that, because you think you killed him, right? Then all of a sudden he picks his head up and goes again, another phase. I think that's really, really good. The optional bosses in the game, Demon of Hatred and Owl the Father, I think his name is, the past version of Owl. Those two bosses are insane, especially Owl. Like, Owl is crazy. Demon of Hatred is more like you need to approach him differently than other bosses. I generally tend to focus Demon of Hatred's health instead of his posture bar, but with Owl is insane. He is probably the hardest boss in the game. A lot of people think, I guess going into the next one I want to talk about, is Inner Ishin, the final boss of the game, is the boss that will test everything that you've learned throughout the game. I don't think he's as hard as Father Owl. Like, a lot of people really think that Ishin is like, oh my god, Ishin is insane. But I don't think he's that bad, really. I'll try and get footage of my fight with him during this whole boss section. I think I'll have that fight playing out, because I think the peak of Sekiro is these boss fights and these boss encounters, because I feel like the common enemies don't really give you what the combat is designed for, because a lot of people, the cling clang combat, with the movement, the clashing of swords, the spectacle of it. I think the bosses are the best way to experience this, and I really think that's what they were going for. I think the bosses are like the main meat of this game, especially considering most common enemies, 3 hits they're dead, as part of mini bosses, but bosses are definitely like the peak of Sekiro. Is the spectacle of it, the way it feels when you get a clean run. It's just really, really amazing, and I think the bosses are the highlight of the game, easily. Okay, the game's replayability. Aside from the usual, New Game Plus cycles, where I believe the game gets harder every New Game Plus cycle with Sekiro, there's also the gauntlets that you can do, which are essentially boss rush modes, which are pretty fun, and you unlock, unique cosmetic skins for completing each of these paths. The gauntlets are locked behind different endings. Well, a few of them are locked behind different endings, so you need to acquire, I think it's 2 different endings to unlock 2 of the gauntlets, and then you need to beat every boss in the game, including the optional ones, to unlock another the other gauntlet too. So I think there's 2 or 3 gauntlets, each rewarding a unique skin at the end of it. There's also multiple challenges you can impose upon yourself, as in there's the Demon Bell, which increases difficulty. And then there's also Kuro's Charm, which you can choose at the start of the game when you get your sword. You can choose to return the charm to Kuro. And this will inflict chip damage upon you unless you perfect parry things. So there's a variety of different, challenges you can impose upon yourself. There's within the game. I mean, there's means within the game to impose these challenges on yourself. There's the gauntlets you can do. But then there's also the New Game Plus cycles, which are a staple of FromSoft games. So I think there's a decent amount of variety, along with the fact of, wanting to play the game more to like master the combat system, because once you master the combat system and you fight bosses and you can just clean sweep bosses, after that time you've sunk into it, it's very rewarding. So I think it hasn't got as much replayability per se as, the Souls games or Bloodborne or whatever. It hasn't got as much replayability as those games, but that comes within the nature of an action-adventure game. But for people who want to seek out the replayability of this game, no, it's definitely there. Let's talk about the world and level design. The world, I think, in Sekiro is one of the best FromSoft have ever designed. I really think it's very unique, with the Sengoku period of Japan and like the feuding states era. I really like the way the world is designed, especially that like medieval, historical Japan setting. Like I'm a big sucker for that type of stuff. You visit a wide variety of locales from like poison-ridden uh, valleys to underground areas to deep hidden towns within the earth, caverns, forest jungles, temples. There's even a divine realm, as they call it. It's even though it's within the world, there's like a divine realm in the mountains. Uh, with the level design especially, once you reach Ashina Castle, that's kind of where you can split off into multiple paths, and there are multiple paths leading in different directions. In a linear style, so it's not like Souls really. There are shortcuts and stuff still, but not to the extent of like the Souls games. Each area is kind of, you progress through each area in like a linear fashion, right? But there's like a huge variety within these areas. Um, Also, there's a lot of verticality, obviously, with the grappling hook. There's a lot of like traversal through the rooftops and through the sky using the grappling hook. Lots of paths you can take through different means. There's a lot of hidden side areas too in Sekiro, areas that don't necessarily lead through story progression, but there's like a lot of optional hidden things you can find, be it like health or damage upgrades to items and mini bosses and the like. There's also underwater sections. There's also underwater exploration and swimming, which is new to From games, obviously. This is the only From Software game since the Miyazaki leadership that has swimming and underwater exploration. And even though combat and stuff is not like in depth underwater, but the fact that you can explore underwater and that there is swimming, you unlock underwater swimming later into the game, but then that unlocks like an entire new way of exploring past areas, because there are bodies of water throughout the game, but you can't explore them until you get the ability to swim underwater and breathe underwater, right? So that encourages a lot of backtracking and exploring old areas, especially since there are things you might want to find, including things that are key to unlocking endings, which you need to be able to explore underwater to get to, which I really like. Like, I like the fact that it's not really, it's kind of Metroidvania-esque, like once you get the water upgrade, you can like go back and explore bodies of water that you've seen throughout the game, but you couldn't dive into and really explore. So I really like that. Even though it's not as big, or as, there's not as many like labyrinthian, as I like to call it, level design from the previous Souls games. I think like the diversity of the world and the various locales you go to really create for like a unique experience compared to Miyazaki's other games. Um, Especially when it comes to atmosphere, right? Because there are so many different locales in this game that they all give you like a different vibe. Like the Mist Village is like really like kind of ominous to explore. Like that whole underground section, or like where you're going deep down, like the atmosphere there is really, really something. And I think that's something that Sekiro really excels in, is like the many different vibes and the many different atmospheres you get while exploring this world. And the fact that they could cram all that into one game, I think it's really well done. And it definitely stands out between From Software's catalogue. I just want to give a quick shout out to the OST as well. I'm not going to go in depth about this, but the OST in this game feels extremely cinematic compared to the other Souls games. It really feels like, or the other games that FromSoft have done recently, whereas in most other FromSofts, like in the Soul series specifically, and Bloodborne and stuff, outside of the hub area and bosses, there's no real music. Where I think Sekiro has much more of an accompaniment. You know, I feel the music really enhances the entire vibe of the game, because you hear music a lot more often in Sekiro. Even when exploring areas, you know, there's usually like atmospheric orchestral accompaniment of music behind everything. And I think it really stands out, especially during the bosses. Bosses usually start with a big swell, and then the boss's music really like accompanies the fight. Where the other with the Souls games and stuff, you wouldn't think, oh well, Elden Ring kind of does it with phase transitions, but generally, I think Sekiro's soundtrack really, really adds to the atmosphere and the vibe that they were going for, and I really, really like the OST. It's going to be playing throughout this video, and so hopefully you'll be able to take notice of how actually well done the OST is. I don't think a lot of people give Sekiro's OST the credit it deserves, because it is very, very good, and it might be one of the better FromSoft OSTs in my opinion. And that's it. That's another video done of me rambling about FromSoft games. Sekiro really stands out as probably one of my favorites. I think Miyazaki and his team really stand out when they're doing new IPs, even when it's heavily inspired by something like Tenchu, right? Because as a Tenchu fan, Sekiro really feels like the Tenchu game we never got. And it really, when I think about games that, when I think about Tenchu, I think that Sekiro is the modern Tenchu game, even though it's explicitly not, you know, but it gives that extreme vibe. Like, you know, Wolf is essentially Rikimaru, and Genichiro is essentially Onikage in a sense, you know. Sekiro stands up with one of my favorites within From's catalog, along with Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, Elden Ring. It really stands up there, especially like when they work on new OST, sorry, not OSTs, when they work on new IPs or like singular entries, I think they're really, really strong, very strong indeed. And that's it. I'm done. I hope you look forward to the next video. It is coming. I'm already started making the new video. It's not a FromSoft game this time, but I hope you look forward to the new video. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I don't usually do this, but please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. It really helps with the algorithm. Check out my second channel, my live streaming channel, where I'm live pretty often playing different games to what I make videos about here. So like anything you want, all my full playthroughs on my live channel. So go check that out if you feel like it. All right, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. See you guys. Peace.